Hey, welcome back to another broadcast of In the Trenches. Today, I sit down with Tom Schwab, who's the founder of Interview Valet, which is a podcast booking service. So if you've ever wanted to get onto a podcast as a guest, Tom and Interview Valet can help. In today's conversation, Tom and I talk about a few different things. First, we begin with the state of podcasting, what's happening in the podcasting space right now, which I believe that podcasting is a subset of just content marketing and content as a whole. And there are some big shifts in the content landscape online, everything from blogging to YouTube and, of course, to podcasting, and how all those changes are impacting the types of podcasts people listen to, what makes a podcast compelling, and so forth. We also talk about the trends and what we see as the future of podcasting. So I talk a little bit about my perspective on kind of the macro growth and connectivity and the advances in technology that make things like podcasting so much more accessible, while Tom provides some really great statistics that him and his company have compiled over the last months and years to give us an idea of where everything's going. So that's kind of fun too, even if you're just curious about the space, even if you're not diving straight into it. But on the practical side of things, we also talk about what makes a podcast a lead generation tool. So if you want to use a podcast, if you want to be a guest on a podcast and use that to generate traffic, leads, and of course sales, what do you need to do to make that happen? So Tom walks us through his process, some things like the types of landing pages to create, why we need to think about mobile optimization first, and much, much more. So without further ado, let's get to it. So Tom, the place I want to start with is let's discuss the state of podcasting, if you will, like the current state of podcasting. I think podcasting kind of came into the scene the last, 5 years, maybe earlier than that. I have no idea, actually, now that I think about it. I know I kind of got into the game around 2014. No, so it must have been around longer than that. I don't think I was that early an adopter. But give us like a snapshot of the current state of podcasting and where you see it going in 2018 and beyond.
Yeah, and Tom, that's a great question because to me, podcasting started when you started to listen to it, right? But it's really about a dozen years out there. And I've asked my girls, my youngest two, what's the pod stand in podcasting? And they roll their eyes and say, well, I don't know, Dad, what's podcasting stand for? And it's like, that was the old days when you had to have an iPod and you had to plug it in to the computer and download and everything. And really, podcasting is really on-demand radio now. You know, often the studies will say 30 to 40, maybe 50% of the U.S. population has listened to a podcast. But I've often asked people, well, do you listen to podcasts? And they're like, no. But then you start asking them about different shows that they listen to, and it could be, an NPR show, and I'd be like, well, that's a podcast. Or they love Sirius XM. Well, there's a lot of content there that is even repurposed. Even sometimes terrestrial radio. I remember about a year ago, I got calls from two buddies from the military that said, hey, I didn't realize you were in town. Let's get together tonight for dinner. And I called them back and I'm like, why do you think I'm in Tucson, Arizona? And they said, well, we heard you on the morning drive. And when I pieced it all together, it was a podcast interview that I had done months before that got picked up and rebroadcast. So to me, podcast is really on-demand radio. And I think that's why it's so powerful. You can, in a lot of new cars, you can download it straight to there. You can download it to phones. It's the only medium that you can listen to when you want, where you want, at the speed you want, and multitask while you're doing it. And so from that standpoint, I just see great upsides for podcasting in there. And so many podcasts now, they'll throw video on it and, throw it up to YouTube. I don't know, is that a podcast or is that something else? Still the same thing. Some people will transcribe them and put them up as blog. Still podcasting at its heart. Some people will take it, put B-roll film over it and put it up on Facebook. So to me, it's just really audio content and, it will never hit 100%. Somebody asked me, when do you think, it'll hit 100%? I'm like, well, television, radio, and newspapers never hit that. But to me, always going to have that portion of people that are audio learners that this fits their life best. So I think that's only going to increase. One of the things we have seen in the data is that the average podcast listener now is better educated, above average income, and listens to 7 hours of content a week. So from that standpoint, for a lot of people, that's their ideal customer.
I was just going to bring that up actually, because only anecdotally can I point to that. I don't have the data, but from my experience, it's always fascinating to me when people reach out to me who have found me via listening to my podcast versus, say, the email list or other ways. And one thing I would say that seems to be consistent across the board when people have been listening to the podcast or that's where they found me, it's typically like professionals, like well-paid professionals, business owners, that are doing relatively well. Whereas with my email list and some of the people who reach out to me who find me, say, organically via Google are more like people just getting started, who are just bootstrapping. And so it's just fascinating to look at that because for me, it's like that's one of the reasons I like to do the podcast. I know not everybody listens to my podcast, but I find that the demographic of people who do are absolutely the kind of people who I want to be talking to. Like they're the ones who I can provide the most value to with the services and the ways I can help them grow their business. And it's just really fascinating to me. So you mentioned you have data on that. I'm curious, do you guys compile this like internally, or how are you able to measure that and to see that you can prove that case
So
statistically?
Yeah. That data came from Edison Research. They put it out something every year on that. We do a study also. It's called the State of Podcast Interviews. So each year we reach out. Last year it was to over 10,000 different marketers, guests, and podcast hosts, and asked a series of questions on that. And it was really interesting to see because, being inside of it, you think, oh, everybody believes the same way I do. But once we started to ask the questions, we got some really surprising answers. Like one of them was, what's the best return on investment for your marketing time in dollars? And I thought, okay, podcast interview marketing will be up there. But I was surprised when it beat Facebook and email marketing. And now, granted, it was just by a small bit, but marketers out there were saying that podcast interviews are converting and providing better return on investment than Facebook or email marketing. And Tom, I really believe in 5 years, people will talk about podcast interview marketing as just another channel. We work with a lot of software as a service companies now. And, I love working with them because they track everything. They know how much each lead costs, how much each customer conversion costs from each channel. And they've come to us with numbers. And I can remember one of them said, do you think you can beat this number with podcast interviews? And I looked at it, and it was probably the most politically incorrect thing I've ever said to a customer. But I said, you could show up drunk on a podcast and beat that number. Well, after a quarter, when they beat that number, they doubled down, and we've become friends since. And they joke that someday they're going to do that just to test the theory. But really, from the standpoint of marketing at its heart, is starting a conversation with somebody that could be an ideal customer. Podcasts are a great, great way to do that.
I particularly like podcasting and YouTube like conversations and interviews. That's kind of actually, I probably watch more YouTube actually, surprisingly, because I'm always at my desk. I'm not necessarily watching, but whether it's a video recording or whatever of interviews. So I do listen. So fundamentally kind of the same deal as podcasts. And I like the long form. I really appreciate that. And what's just so cool and so fascinating about the era we live in is that now long form conversations are accessible to anyone. Whereas before you always get the forced soundbite of some news organization. And I think it's becoming clear as day that that's one of the reasons TVs or we'll say news stations and just television in general is dying, because it has to force something into a particular format, a particular length of time. And you don't get any it's hard to get much value out of that because people are reduced to a soundbite.
Yeah,
Whereas these long, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Exactly. It's depth. And I think that's one of the trends we're seeing as podcasting matures. It started out, and doing a good interview can be tough. And it was easier for the host and the guest at times to ask, the same 5 questions to everybody. And I think that's really starting to die out. NPR came in and really raised the bar for everybody. And I think you're right, that long form, authentic dialogue, you see those shows, those are the ones that are really not only doing well, but growing, and their subscribers are really adamant. And they're fanatics.
Yeah, and so one of the things I'm curious about is, so I have a few questions I want to get into, but I think probably maybe the place to start would be for those people. You mentioned that podcasting is converts really well. That's it's interesting to me because in my experience, I find that it's not nearly as effective as some of the other strategies I've used. But the metric I would be using probably there is like subscribers. And so a lot of times I don't have my stuff necessarily that locked down tight for a podcast, like if I'm a guest on it. And so it's really actually hard for me to say, except anecdotally, like when people let me know that they found me through the podcast. So my numbers are off. Like I'll be honest, but I also find that while it's a great demographic to get in front of, it's really hard to go from podcast and the typical way somebody listens to it to going and taking action on something. So it's a great medium for educating and teaching. I don't see it as the best medium for turning or using as a medium for calls to action, like something visual. But you're kind of proving me wrong based on what you're saying. So explain to me how that I can take advantage if I'm a podcast guest, if I'm a guest on a podcast, how I can take best advantage of that podcast. And let's just assume that the person actually has good points. They're smart, they're articulate, they have all that going for them. If there's anything to get into in terms of like best ways to handle the conversation, that's great. But also, I just want to talk the big thing I think as well is like let's assume you're engaging. How do you actually turn those new listeners into, say, subscribers or new trial opt-ins or sales?
And I would agree with you 100% and disagree at the same time. So I agree that
Good. That's what these conversations are all about.
right, and I can agree and disagree with myself at times, but
Right.
podcasts are an awful place to sell. Nobody wants an infomercial, and I'd agree with that on I think the internet overall. I don't go to the internet so somebody can sell something to me. I go to get an answer to my question. Right. And those people that answer that question the best get the know, like, and trust. They attract me, we engage, and ultimately I become a customer of theirs. So with that, I think you've got to use that same framework. I'm an average communicator. And even I acknowledge that there is no way I can answer every question and give every resource to somebody in a 20 or a 40-minute interview, right? You talk about long form dialogue. Well, you're just sort of opening that stuff up. And to talk about something and not give them a place to go is actually a disservice to them. Like one of the things that I'll talk about when people ask, well, how do you get on your first podcast? Well, there's like 6 things that I've said, the secrets, they're not secrets to getting on your first podcast. Well, if I just list all of those, that doesn't serve anybody. Right? They're multitasking. So not that I'm trying to sell or sign them up, but give them a place to go to get that. If there's more information, a video training, something that you can serve them with, give them a place to go to. And then finally, if somebody listened to you and really resonated with what you had to say, well, don't make them hunt you down to find you. There's a client of ours, Bill Troy, wrote a great book called Clicksand, How Digital Marketing is Destroying Your Business. And one of the points he makes is that whales don't go through funnels and big fish don't click. So from that standpoint, if you're selling a $1.99 product, you can put somebody through a sales funnel. But if you're selling a high value relationship based product, where you're really looking at customer lifetime value, well, you've got to give them a chance that after they've heard you for 20, 40, whatever minutes, that you've got to give them a way to connect with you. So I think there's very soft ways that you can do that. One of the things that our testing has always shown, and I've talked to some people that present from the stage and they're like, yeah, that's how you do it from the stage. And podcasts really are just a digital stage, is to give people 3 ways to say yes. So a small yes, a medium yes, and then a heck yes, where they come, ready to engage.
Can you elaborate on those 3 yeses? Like what might be an example?
I'll pull back the curtain. Okay, so here's exactly how I would do it on a podcast interview. So if we were talking about how to get booked on your first podcast, I'd say I'd tell a couple of those, and I'd say, hey, if you want a download of this, it's not behind a form or anything. Everything that Tom and I talked about, I'll just put that at interviewvalet.com .com/trenches. So you've given them a place to go. You've given them a small yes. And now you can see how a welcome page works if you go there, right? You have no idea who Tom Schwab looks like, but you know who Tom the host looks like. You know what the artwork for the host looks like. So our testing has shown that if you send them to that page and the first thing they see is the orange logo for In the Trenches, and you see Tom's picture, those trust seals keep it from bouncing, people just leaving, and it also increases the conversion rates. So on that page, then there'd be some boilerplate text and then the 3 yeses, the small yes, the medium yes, and the heck yes. So for me, a lot of times the medium yes could be a free copy of my book, right? I wrote a book called Podcast Guest Profits. You can buy it on Amazon, but I give more away free, just the digital download. So that might be the medium yes, right? It's a little bit more time, but if somebody's interested in doing this. And then finally, the big yes, if somebody has listened to me and they're like, wow, that would work in my business. I'll say something like, if any of this resonated with you, if you'd like to see the best practices and how this could apply to you, why don't you just go over to that same page, interviewvalet.com /trenches, and I'll put a link to my calendar. Grab a time on my calendar, and I'd be thrilled, to give you a 15-minute assessment of your business and how you could use podcast interview marketing. So you see, there with all of those, I'm giving more information, more tools, all the rest of that. But I'm never saying, hey, buy something here. Because one of the things that a podcast host pointed out to me, Doug Sandler from the Nice Guys on Business, he said, if you do a good job on a podcast, you don't have to promote yourself. The host will promote you. And that's one of the things we always teach our clients is, your goal for being there is to make the host look like a genius for having you.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I agree. No use to sell on a podcast makes no sense. And I think you have to take it from the approach of this is something that will be out there in perpetuity. And so what helps me today, tomorrow, next week, next year is probably a good way to think about it. I wonder where the future of podcasting will go in terms of back, what do you call it? I don't know, back order content. I don't even know what you describe that, or like really old episodes. What do you guys call that? Is there a term for this?
Evergreen content.
Well, yeah, but how about stuff that like if somebody's producing like a daily episode for years, like John Lee Dumas, a buddy of mine, and he's like got thousands of episodes. Like, what do you call like those original episodes? Is there a term for that in podcasting? Because we know it's evergreen. It's always there, kind of. But is there? I'm just wondering if there's a technical term.
I've never heard of a technical term for that. That being said, our client that's been with us the longest and has the biggest experience has got podcasts now that are out almost 4 years. And the amazing part is that he still gets traffic, leads, and sales from those. And we know that because remember, you can also attribute the traffic. So if I gave out a special URL, if you showed up to that URL, the only way you're going to find that is through the podcast. And the other thing that really helps with that too is that, if I talk about a product, and right now it's 2018. If somebody's listening to this in 2020 and I just sent them to my homepage, it could be totally different. So if they listen to it 2 years later, you wouldn't want them to come, be disappointed, the traffic bounce, and really you lose that. So from that standpoint, for the evergreen content, you can make an evergreen place for them to go to.
Yep, that makes sense. Okay, so and that was actually, you touched on it. So do you typically recommend like a unique landing page for every single guest's podcast that you would be on? I mean, it could be fundamentally the same, you're just duplicating or something like that. But is that something you typically recommend? I know you guys it seems like you guys recommend from the outside. My perception is that you do have people create like these special landing pages. Is it one? Is it multiple? One per episode? Or how do you typically, what do you recommend for your clients?
Yeah, I always say that everybody's got an opinion, but we look at the data for what actually works. And we've tested this over and over and over time, and it always comes back the same way. If you send them to a dedicated welcome page, so it's a little bit different than a landing page, right? It's got the navigation. If they want to look around, they can. But we make one of those for each and every podcast interview. and recommend that, because it not only allows you to attribute the traffic to say where it came from, but it gives a special feel. So now that you just don't send them to a generic page, and those trust seals of the podcast artwork and the host picture, that increases your conversion rates, right? It's a trust seal. It's almost like the old Better Business logo or something next to it, because this is a friend of theirs. They trust them. And it cuts down on the bounce rate, because a lot of people are going to podcast or going to the site after listening to it on a podcast from a mobile device. That traffic is prone to bounce. But if the first thing they see is, the In the Trenches logo and Tom's picture, they know they're on the right place, so the traffic doesn't bounce nearly as much.
That makes you wonder if then, when you think about podcast marketing, like from this perspective, that it would be, well, maybe this is just common sense, but I'm just thinking out loud here, that it's crucial then to actually be mobile optimized for podcasting. You could say, well, mobile optimized for everything, but maybe even thinking in terms of that first before anything else, because probably the typical person is actually going to be on their phone. And then if there's something where you could even have the call to action, instead of it being, say, like opt in, which is kind of clunky, maybe it's like a one button opt into the Facebook Messenger. Not that I'm suggesting you do that or that that's even a good strategy, but people are already on their phone. They're probably already logged into it. That actually might be a really compelling way to turn that traffic into leads. What you do with it after that, of course, that would depend. But have you guys tested anything like that?
We've tested some with like bots and Facebook Messengers. Yeah, it
Verdict's
didn't.
Out.
The verdict is still out there. We're also testing text to opt in also.
Yeah.
The verdict's still out on that one also.
Okay. See, you got to let me know when you have some data on that. That's one of the things I would actually just love to test out, even just with my own podcast. So as this goes live, somebody listens to it, maybe I have a call to action at the beginning of the episode or end to have somebody do something. Mine, I really don't have any calls to action in my podcast at all. It just kind of ends and I say, well, go check out the show notes, which is, it does what it does. But I am actually now kind of curious how I could optimize even my own podcast, the one that I'm hosting, let alone, of course, then what other people could do if they are a guest and channeling that traffic. So, and that kind of segues into my next question here. What do you recommend? And because I know you guys have your hand on the pulse of just podcasting in general in the space. In terms of like the future, you had mentioned some people are like repurposing content, taking podcasts, putting them on YouTube, doing B-roll over it. Obviously, I know a few people, more than a few, who do like video interviews and then they repurpose that into podcast content. And so maybe it's a perspective on both of these, a combination. But in terms of like the future of podcasting, where do you see are like going to be the developments that actually get people more interested in your podcast? So like if you're the podcast host, so this is a selfish question. I'm wondering like what I could do to be at, say, the forefront besides just doing what I'm doing, which is, recording, doing some editing, publishing. But if there's something I could be doing here, whether it is, and perhaps that is from the repurposing that you guys have seen that works really well, or anything like that, where there's ways I could just create more value out of my own podcast and for listeners fundamentally. Any thoughts or suggestions on that?
I think the better question or bigger question on that is, what's the future of content? Right. So,
well, yeah, there you go. Yeah.
What in podcasting, I just look at that as it's content, if you want to call it audio or whatever. So I think there was a couple points in there that you hit on. One is produce it in the way that's easiest to you and distribute it in the way that's best for your customers. So for some people, they don't mind, or they love being on video. So for them, it's really easy to do a video podcast and then rip off the audio to do an audio only. So for them, they're comfortable with that. Personally, for me, I can write a blog, but it's homework, right? It's a homework assignment. I love talking. So with that, I can answer questions and then transcribe that, Temi.com for 10 cents a minute and get that transcribed, then have somebody else clean it up to make it into a blog. So for me, it's really looking at saying, which way can I put out the maximum volume and quality of content? And then what tools can I use to repurpose that so that people can consume it in the way they want. Because I think it's vain to think just because I like to put out audio that all my customers are going to want to consume it in that way. So to me, that's really the sort of an underlying thing. And I think we've got the technology to do that. Going back to your question also is that the more people we can get connected in something, the better it is. There was an old joke on how do you sell a newspaper in a small town? You put everybody's name in it because everybody will buy it and their mom will buy 5 copies, right? So get people involved in it. I see a lot of podcasters do this where they'll reference like a previous episode they did. So we'll be in the middle of a conversation. They're like, we talked with so-and-so back on episode whatever. And that he went into that also. And, if you're interested in that, go back to that point. And I think that's very important because it helps people find the content better. And if they're just, if they've got 7 hours of content they're listening to and you're putting out 1 hour of content, give them a reason to go back and listen to something in your archives there. So I would do that. The other thing is getting people involved also. Mentioning, people that like leave reviews. I think there's something about that. I can think of some podcasts out there, Legends and Losers. At the end, he always gives shout outs to people. And there's a lot of podcasts when the interview wraps up, or when they're toward the end making their pitch, a lot of times I'll just, go to the next one. But I tell you what, when Christopher Lochhead puts all those shout outs at the end, I stick around for who he's going to give the shout out to. And one of the funny things he always does is, some big national leader or somebody in the news, they'll always throw out there, sorry, we really wanted to get you on, but we ran out of time. So it's sort of funny at the very end there. So I think the more people we can get involved, bringing that whole community together, that helps also.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me, and because I've been thinking about this recently, like the future 2018 and beyond. What does the digital marketing landscape look like? And so, just looking at the fundamentals, like the macro, and then bring it down to the the micro, really, and the tangible things somebody can do to capitalize. The increase of connectivity across the globe. There's an increase in the average purchase volume per person across the globe. So right now it's at about 10% of, across the globe, 10% of all sales, retail sales, are purchased online. That actually seems surprisingly low to me. And obviously it's averaged out, but that's climbing. So, and then the amount of people who are actually making the majority of their purchases online, so over 50% of the purchase online, that's going to be a reality here. Well, it's already happening, but the amount of people who are making the majority of the purchase online, that's the trajectory. And so people are doing more and more and more stuff online. And the bottom line of that is, the reason I'm bringing that up is because it influences the long tail, which is something I've been writing about recently and sharing on my newsletter. And this idea that, and that's why I was asking if there's a term for this with podcasts, like those old episodes. What do we call that? Like when you look at it, say back order or something like that of a catalog, it's like before Amazon, it was really hard to get a hold of a book if it wasn't in print. I mean, near impossible. And now it's like there's literally millions of choices on demand anytime you want. So all of a sudden, these long tail books are selling and they can continue to sell. And so I look at that and say, podcasting, it's in the same space, same sphere. So the more people who get online, the more people who start listening to podcasts, the more podcasts will grow across the board. So it is truly a rising tide. With that said, I'm curious your opinion on this from a podcast host perspective. What are the things that I could do as a podcast host, and a podcast creator, to increase the exposure of my own podcast, specifically in relation to perhaps like the community element of it? Does that make sense what I'm asking? Like, is there a way I can leverage the podcast community to, say, grow my reach or influence? Any ideas on that?
As far as your community or expanding the community?
It would be selfishly to expand the listeners of my podcast. And although, of course, I hope I'm not just a take, that there's a give here, but if there's some way to capitalize on this growth across all channels, is it simply just me get on other people's podcasts, get them on mine, and this kind of cross pollination, or any ideas in terms of like how a podcast creator, a podcast host, can leverage the podcast community as a whole to grow their own platform.
Yeah. And with this, a lot of times as I look for the next answer coming up, I try to look back and say, how would my grandfather have done this? Because while he wouldn't have understood the tools we have today, I think he understood the strategy better. And so if I would have asked him that question, I think what he told me is like, or the question he would have asked is like, well, where could you find more podcast listeners? And I think Cliff Ravenscraft pointed this out one time at Podcast Movement. He said, if you go on Facebook right now and look for podcast listeners, 60, 70% of the people will have no idea what you're talking about. But he said, if you go on other people's podcasts, you can be guaranteed 100% of the people that you talk to listen to podcasts and are probably looking for more podcasts to listen to, right? So if the average podcast listener is consuming 7 hours of content, even if they listen to a daily show, I can't think of a daily show that's out there that's an hour long. So there's probably something else they're looking for. So with that, go to where the fish are. So if you want to build your community of, in Instagram, go to people and coordinate with people that have other big Instagram accounts. Same way, if you want to get bigger in television, go on more television. I would say for podcasts, it would be working with and getting on more podcast shows out there. And I don't think it's, stealing an audience, because we're not competing against each other, right? What we're competing against is that 60 or 70% of the world that isn't hooked on podcasts right now. So really, it's, to me, just serving that community. And, you've got to be very strategic and targeted on it. There's 400,000 podcasts out there. There's probably just a small percentage that would have your ideal type of listeners. And those are the ones you want to really focus on.
I love it. Well, anything that we haven't covered today, Tom, that kind of stands out to you that maybe, especially kind of considering, I know we've kind of gone a bunch of different places with this, but anything that stands out to you in terms of like the person who's listening to this, who's hearing this conversation about the future of podcasting, how to take advantage of podcasts, anything else that you think is actually relevant for that demographic who are using podcasting to grow their businesses that I haven't actually asked about?
Well, Tom, the thing that's scaring me right now is there's somebody probably out there in like 2025 listening to this. And I hope we didn't make them laugh too much. I hope we got it at least the right direction it was going to. But I know there's one thing, so if they're looking back at this point, that they would notice, just like the same way people that listen to podcasts now notice. They know the power of the medium. They know how it connects, how it builds relationships, and they know it's growing, right? So the question is if you're in business, if you've got something to share, something to spread, customers to help and serve, the question is like, how are you going to get in front of them? And you know that in the future, they're going to be listening more and more to podcasts. So the really question that you've got to ask yourself is, are they going to hear you, or are they going to hear your competition? Now, if it's hearing you, it could be as a podcast guest, podcast host, both of those. But I would just encourage people that, it's easier than ever to share what you know. And what you know is ordinary to you, but amazing to others. And so find a way to share that on a podcast. And, if I can be of any help with that, please reach out and let me know.
Tom, I love it. Well, great conversation with that. And ending on that note, where can people reach out to find you, connect with you guys, and maybe even use your services?
I was going to say, since I used that example in the beginning, let's stay consistent there. Just go to interviewvalet.com/trenches, and everything Tom and I talked about will be there. You can see a sample welcome page. So you can see behind the curtain there how it's done. I'll put the secrets to get on your first podcast. I'll put a checklist of the ones that I use and all my clients use to get ready for podcast interviews, a way to get in touch with me there. I'll even put all my social media on there. I know you're probably writing, or you're probably driving, running, multitasking. So I won't try giving you my Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, all the rest of that. It'll be all on the page. Just go to interviewvalet.com/trenches.
Awesome, Tom. Thank you so much for being in the trenches and sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us. It was definitely a pleasure.
Thank you, Tom.